50 years ago, Canada did something that no other democratic nation had done before. It declared multiculturalism as official policy. It was a bold stance and one that could have even been quite risky. With us now to explain, as part of the joint TVO Toronto Star initiative, the Democracy Agenda, we're joined from Kingston, Ontario, by Keith Banting. He is a professor emeritus in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University, and we're delighted to welcome you, Professor Banting, to our program. How are you managing these days?
I'm coping.
That's a good word to use.
Thank you for having me.
That is a good word to use.
Coping the way everyone else is. We live in very small worlds at the moment.
Ain't it the truth? Well, on a recent program we did here on TVO, the Globe and Mail's John Ibbitson had this to say about the subject we're about to dive into. Sheldon, if you would.
Well, it is a truism that everything that happens in the United States eventually happens in Canada, and to a lesser degree. So it is probably true that the kinds of resentments, the really unfortunate and regrettable nativist resentments, the resentments of the rural towards the urban, the cultural resentments that fired Trumpism are here in Canada as well. It's probably also true that thanks to social media, the transfer across the border of the tensions between progressives and conservatives, the rendering of that debate from "I disagree with you" to "you are illegitimate in my eyes," is going to happen here faster than it might have happened in the past.
That's John Ibbitson from the Globe and Mail. You have spent your career studying diversity and multiculturalism, and I wonder whether you think John Ibbitson is right to fear that some of that ideological nativism, as I think he called it, might seep over the border and come to us. What do you think?
Well, I think John's on to something. I'm glad he also said it would happen here to a lesser degree, because I think that's probably true. Certainly some of those resentments are here. We've seen greater polarization in attitudes towards immigration. The overall headline number about support for immigration is remarkably stable. But if you dig underneath it, you find that there's now quite a sharp polarization in the attitudes of voters for the major political parties. A polarization in which conservative supporters are less enthusiastic about immigration than they were even in the early 2000s. And liberal supporters have become, if anything, more so. So we do have an opening divide. We have urban-rural splits, no question. And there are elements of white nationalism in Canada that cannot be denied. I think it's less intense here, and I think it would remain less intense. One major distinguishing feature about Canada, which I think is actually more unusual across countries than even our enthusiasm for multiculturalism, is that Canadians believe immigration is a positive economic factor. That is, it's a boost to the economy. You do not find that as strongly in other countries. So that counterbalances to some extent the anxiety about culture and the sort of implications that immigrants may not share our values. They are, in statistical terms, it's almost a dead heat between those two. And that counterbalances to some extent the impact of nativism.
Well, let me jump in here because I want to take you back. Let me jump in because I want to take you back more than 50 years to the United States, where in 1964 they passed the Civil Rights Act, which was historic, and the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965, again historic. And then 50 years ago this year, the current Prime Minister's father had this to say. He said, "Uniformity is neither desirable nor possible in a country the size of Canada. We should not even be able to agree upon the kind of Canadian to choose as a model, let alone persuade most people to emulate it. There are few policies potentially more disastrous for Canada than to tell all Canadians that they must be alike. There is no such thing as a model or ideal Canadian. What could be more absurd than the concept of an all-Canadian boy or girl? A society which emphasizes uniformity is one which creates intolerance and hate." Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau back in 1971. So here we are 5 decades later. We used to say that the U.S. was the melting pot and we were the mosaic. Do you think those labels are still appropriate 5 decades on?
Yeah, they capture something about the basic um, formal conception of the country, which animates most of the kind of stuff we get from governments. And I think it is central has become central to the conception of Canada and our sense of national identity. But if you dig down deeper, there are more mixed views in the public as a whole. We did a comparative survey of Canada and the United States a few years ago, and we asked a very standard question, which was, what does it take to be truly Canadian? And there was a disconcertingly large number, not a majority, but a large number that would say things like, yeah, to be truly Canadian, you have to have been born here, or your parents have to have been born here, or perhaps most troublingly, to be a true Canadian, you have to be Christian. So what the Prime Minister said, I think, is part of the central ethos of our identity, but it's not perfectly shared within the population as a whole. So there are tensions in any society, and we have our share of them.
Well, let's put some numbers up here to reflect more about what you've just said, and I'll get our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring this up. There was a survey done on the percentages of the population of a variety of countries who are opposed to increasing diversity. And if we look overseas, the United Kingdom, only 20% of the population surveyed opposed increased diversity. In Sweden, it's 30%. Germany, 32%. The Netherlands, 36%. Italy, 45%. Greece, a very large number, 62%. How about us and the United States? How did we fare? Who's opposed to increasing diversity? In Canada, just 19%. And in the United States, just 17%. What do you infer from those North American numbers? Let's start there.
Well, they're not a surprise. Both of those countries are historic countries of immigration. Both of them have been built by successive waves of immigration, and therefore diversity is a much more accomplished cultural and social fact in the history of the country and its conception of itself. The fact that the United States is quite that low actually was reassuring. So the two North American countries aren't a big surprise.
So let's go to Europe then, where maybe it is a bigger surprise to see Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands, which are thought to be three fairly progressive welfare states. They're all nudging up around a third of the population that opposes increased multiculturalism. What do you infer from that?
You know, I find those numbers surprisingly reassuring. The numbers in Greece and Italy are not a surprise, but I think the other numbers are a bit curious, because if you look at similar polls about immigration, do you support higher level of immigration, or do you even support the existing level of immigration, you will get larger numbers opposed. So if anything, that strikes me as a reasonably hopeful sign.
Well, okay, but having said that, you know, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who many people think of as, I mean, the way she opened the doors to migrants coming from such troubled countries in the Middle East was really quite astonishing all those years ago. She said 10 years ago, Multikulti, as she called it, that's what it's called in German, was not working out. And a year later, David Cameron, the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, said that state multiculturalism was a failure. So my follow-up question to you is, what have we learned from the European experience over the last 10 years about the relationship between multiculturalism and liberal democracy?
I don't know that we, Canada, have learned very much. What was striking about the Europeans is that they developed an idea about what multiculturalism was, which was quite distorted with Canadian assumptions about what we mean by it. They came to believe that multiculturalism meant to legitimate and promote segmented societies, or what the Germans called parallel societies inside a country. That was never the Canadian meaning, at least as it refers to immigration. In Canada, multiculturalism was always seen as an integrationist philosophy, one that wanted to change the institutions and policies of the country to make it easier for immigrants to join the mainstream, but it was always about fair terms of integration. But what the Europeans did is when they were upset and thought multiculturalism was about integration, about separation, they introduced what we would call integration policies. They called them civic integration, but they were all about language training. They were about facilitating the movements of immigrants into the economy and into society generally. And the more they did that, the more they looked like us. We have always combined multiculturalism policies with very strong and potent integration policies. We spent a bundle on language training, on settlement, on employment preparation for immigrants. So our conception of multiculturalism has always been about the terms of integration into society, not about building separate societies.
Well, let me pick up on that, because I wonder whether we have to break this down even further, whether we can't just call it Canadian multiculturalism, whether we have to say English Canadian multiculturalism is one thing, Quebec multiculturalism is certainly a different kind of thing. Would you agree we've got to break it down that way?
Absolutely. I think in this area, the difference between the rest of Canada and Quebec is quite sharp, certainly at the level of presentation and discourse. In Quebec, multiculturalism is rejected extensively in political circles and intellectual circles, and they embrace something that they call interculturalism. And the basic difference is that their view is that multiculturalism treats every culture the same, including the historic culture of the native born. And in Quebec, they're reluctant to do that because they have a certain amount of anxiety about how do you survive as a French-speaking community in an English-speaking continent. And so they don't want the historic French culture to be just one among many. They want to privilege it, and they want to encourage newcomers more strongly than elsewhere, or in the rest of Canada perhaps, to join that social project. And so they use levers differently than we do in Canada, seen most markedly recently in the different approaches towards religious dress and Muslim attire for women.
Well, I suspect you could go even further than that. I mean, many in Quebec see diversity as a threat to their national solidarity. Do you think they're wrong to feel that way?
Well, in 1995, it was very clear that sort of historic French Canadians voted to separate Canada, and immigrant communities did not. So at one level, the diversity in the province did threaten that social project. I think what is interesting is that since then, Quebec intellectuals and Quebec governments have worked very hard to refashion the idea of Quebec nationalism, moving away from a traditional ethnic conception based on the 400 families in old Quebec to a more liberal or civic conception, it's sometimes called, which says, you don't have to be from the past. You don't have to adopt the culture of the past, as long as you adopt the basic laws and principles, liberal democratic principles, and support the kind of agenda that Quebec broadly has defined for itself. And yet they've done that, but even still, turns out liberal nationalists, civic nationalists, are still prepared to impose conceptions of the common project on minorities. And so the volunteer liberal nationalists, many of them do support the requirement that people not wear religious dress in public settings.
Professor, this is going to sound like a leading question, but trust me, it's not meant to be. It's just meant to be a neutral, open-ended question. I put that on the record right now. Do you think that different countries, depending on their histories, and you've looked at this for many decades, depending on their histories, their different geographies, their different cultures, do they have a limit on how much diversity their democracies can handle?
Whoa, that's it's not a loaded question, but it's a big question. what we have found is that there's no upper limit on, on sort of the proportion of the population born outside the country, which is the way people measure the immigration flow. There's no upper limit. Countries with very high immigrant populations can be relatively settled with that number as long as the number is relatively stable. Where you get political anxiety is when the number, the proportion of foreign-born in the country is rising rapidly. So a country like Canada, long settled, large immigration, as long as those numbers are relatively stable over time, you don't get political reactions. Where you get political reactions is where you have a country which doesn't have a history of immigration, or which has a history of relatively low levels of immigration, but then you see a spike in the numbers. And that has proven to be politically unsettling everywhere. Whether we're talking about, I don't know, sort of what's going on in Europe post the big surge in Syrian refugees in 2015, or whether even here in Canada, in the early 1990s, even in a recession, the size of the immigration intake each year rose sharply. And we had some, in that period, a majority of Canadians said the level of immigration was too high, something we have not seen since.
Well,
so I think it's the pace of change in a society which is critical, and I don't know of any upward bound which says you can't go beyond this level.
Well, okay, I take your point, but in our remaining moments here, let me follow up on this, because there certainly is a sense among moderate, progressive Canada that if you are critical of multiculturalism, you are somehow outside of the national conversation. And if that's the case, how concerned are you that there is a potential for increased polarization in Canada, and that it will center around issues such as multiculturalism and immigration?
Well, I think if I had to pick an issue, immigration would have a potential. And as I said earlier, we are seeing a division in the attitudes of Canadian voters, a growing split between the parties. And we saw in the latter part of the Harper government a tendency to mobilize attitudes around Muslims and the niqab. And so I think there's a potential there. The Tories were never very happy about multiculturalism, reflecting the strain from the Reform Party. And so there's no question there's a potential there. It is interesting that despite that, the concept of multiculturalism still resonates in the population as a whole. Even though the Conservative government tried to change our sense of Canadian identity towards one more rooted in British history and institutions, in our history in war and other big national projects. At the level of public opinion, support for multiculturalism was absolutely flat right through their government. And even at the end of their government, multiculturalism was the most common answer that Environics Institute got when it asked the question, what is truly distinctive about Canada? So I think that we will have our divisions and our conflicts. It is more likely about immigration. There will be battles and tensions around diversity. I think people will avoid attacking the idea of multiculturalism, which has a kind of symbolic resonance, at least in English-speaking Canada. So the tensions will, in some places, be a bit indirect. I think what's going on in the Conservative Party right at the moment is an interesting test. Right? They're wrestling with these demons, or wrestling with these issues. I should be less pejorative. Wrestling with these issues, which flowed in or was a problem for them in the 2015 election. They are wrestling with that social conservatism in their ranks. They decided it hurt them in recent elections, and part of that will be these issues will become bound up in those sorts of struggles. So that's to me the indicator. That's the place to watch.
That's Professor Keith Banting from Queen's University. We appreciate your being there for us on the line from Kingston, Ontario. You be well, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.